Hello, BookTube and PoetryTube. My name is Mike Frost, the postmodernist poetry prognosticator. Today, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my experiences with reading Alice Walker's Taking the Arrow Out of the Heart, or more broadly, my experiences with Alice Walker's writings. But in this case, try to focus on the poetry as much as I possibly can. I get a little carried away when speaking of Alice Walker because I like her so much. So we'll start with the title, the taking the arrow out of the heart. This arrow is not like a Cupid type arrow. It's not what it's referring to. The arrow that's being referred to here is like sorrows or affronts or insults, these sorts of things. Sorrows. We'll use the word sorrows here. So it's taking the arrows of sorrows out of the heart. And the other thing I kind of note in the title is it's the article "the" for the heart. It's not the personal possessive "my" as in my, taking the arrow out of my heart. So there's a little bit. Alice Walker's a practicing Buddhist, so there's some Buddhist attachment to that article "the," and there's also, after reading the poetry, there's a little of the pedagogical distancing that's involved there. So it's a kind of, the way I felt like after reading the poems is there's a bit of the both in there, that detachment, and there is some Buddhist thought you can tell behind the poems. It's not like Buddhist evangelical, or Buddhists are not evangelical to begin with, but you can sense the philosophy, her philosophy of Buddhism behind it, and there is some pedagogical aspects of the poems. But it's not love poems. It's sorrows, taking the arrows of sorrow out of the heart, recovering from sorrows, recovering from traumas. That's what the title is. Now, Alice Walker is, to me, one of the most important voices of my era, and this era, if I can extend her beyond, because she's still writing and still speaking and still communicating her thoughts. And she's, to me, one of the most important voices we have on the world stage. And I love her as a novelist. I love her as an essayist, as a writer, as a activist, as a person. And I like her as a poet. So I'm going to try to walk a very fine line here in how I discuss her poetry as compared to her person. So to get, I guess, to get a sense of how I look at it, how I approach Alice Walker. So a little bit of the history for my approaches to Alice Walker. I read her first, not her first novel, her first widely known novel, The Color Purple, sometime in the late 80s. It was after the movie came out. When the book came out in the early 80s, I think, I was overseas. I was somewhere, either the Middle East or Near East, somewhere in there, and I didn't even know the book was out. When the movie came out, I picked up the book because of all the hype. I wasn't in a place where I could go to the movies. I was still overseas, but I heard all the hype, so I picked up the book, and I think almost everybody else, loved it. But I didn't follow it up with the rest of her works. It was years later that I picked up the next book, and it's not quite a series or a trilogy or anything, but its characters are related, in the Temple of My Familiar, or what I would call the Temple of My Familiar. So some people get confused of why Alice decided that she was going to make this a bilingual book. It's got the Spanish translations with her poetry, and I think you could trace it back to her experiences when she was writing the Temple of My Familiar, in which she went to Mexico, and you'd have to read that book, but the reason there's a Spanish translation of this, I think, can be traced directly back to the Temple of My Familiar. And it wasn't, and I read that book, like in 1990, we'll say, round at that time. And then I didn't read anything else of hers. I've read some other African American authors. I was getting familiar with the Harlem Renaissance, I think, at that time. When I met my wife at that time, when I met my wife had always been a reader prior to us meeting, but at the time that we met, she was in what we call a reading slump. And I was trying to encourage her to get back into reading because I was an avid reader then, as I am now. And to get her, didn't really work out quite as well as I'd hoped. But when we started dating, she picked up on the reading bug again. So to start, we started with African American female authors to kind of get her back into. Okay, so a little context there. My wife is an African American female. So in order to get her back into reading, I chose the category of African American female writers to get us started as a reading group, if you will, as a reading couple. So we went around, we started collecting African American female authors. I was a collector at that time as well, first editions. These books behind me and over there are all first edition African American female authors. And I don't know if you can see behind me, but most of them are in at least 2 copies because we were reading them together. I was reading one, she was reading one. They're both first editions. If you see 3, there's some of them with 3 books back there. It's because we would find a way to get a signed copy. So some of these are signed. I've got signed copies from Toni Morris and Maya Angelou and some from Alice Walker as well. So it was a collection and a way of getting her back into reading, and we started reading. And so one of the first books that I picked up was Possessing the Secrets of Joy. This book here. Not one of her best known novels, but man, shouldn't it be. This book, if this book don't make you a feminist, I don't know what would. It's the main character in this book and some of the other characters in this book, African female, not African American, an African female, undergoes as part of her tribal rituals of genital mutilation, female castration. This book is one big trigger warning, okay? And if it doesn't affect you, it doesn't make you a feminist, I don't know what would in the world. This book would make Donald Trump a feminist. It was stunning in my reaction to it. And Serendipity Bookstores. We used to live in Santa Barbara. We'd drive up to Berkeley just to go to this bookstore and buy books. Great bookstore. And happen to have a signed copy. So one of my great possessions. Possessing the Secrets of Joy. Okay. If you've never read any of Alice Walker, read that book. Start with The Color Purple. Go to the Temple of My Familiar. But get to that book. It'll change you. And after that, I got into, I found a book of her poetry. So this was the first book of poetry. I didn't know she had written smaller books of poetry. This is a collection of poetry, of her poetry. And at that time, I wouldn't call it widely read in poetry. I read a lot of poetry, but I wouldn't say I was so widely read that I could recognize. But I was familiar with the images. And I was very impressed with some of her imagist poetry. I still have tabs in this thing from way back when. Let me see what I tabbed here. Morning mists on the road, an elephant. He knows his rights. So I would categorize these as imagist poems. And here's where I think that Instagram poets, look up imagist poets. This is your roots. Start drawing from them. The clear Nile, a fat crocodile, scratches his belly and yawns. The rainforest, red orchids, glorious, and near one's eye, the spinning cobra. So now there's longer poems in this. There's one section that's what I would call imagist poems, but here and I've always kind of associated her with. I think that's probably her best poetry, is as an imagist. And when she gets away from that, I think she gets away from her strength. But a little bit more on that later. So some of the other, after Possessing the Secrets of Joy, of course, I started looking all over for any kind of books. One of the other books that I will mention is, I think I got it up here. Yeah. By the Light of My Father's Smile. If you are a father, read this book. I read it before my wife and I started having children, but I don't know if this is a signed edition. Oh, it's not a signed edition, but there's a picture of my wife, my beautiful bride. It's taken when we were married, 2002, a lot of years ago. But when we had our daughter, I picked this book back up and learned from it. If you're a father, read this book. I'm not talking about fathers of African American females either, just any father. Read Alice Walker. And of course, I followed her as an activist. And if you look up Alice Walker, you might find some silly nonsense about her being anti-Semitic. Just nothing could be further from the truth. You can be against what the country of Israel does to the Palestinians and not be anti-Semitic. It's possible to be both a lover of the Palestinians and not anti-Semitic at the same time. Don't believe the nonsense you'd hear about that stuff. So as an activist all over the world for indigenous people's rights, for Palestine, for women's, as a feminist activist, she's a remarkable mind and a great voice. Which brings me back to Taking the Arrows out of the Heart. When I was so looking forward to this book, and I've had it on my shelf for a little while, and I've waited for Black History Month to do my review. So I waited to read it because I knew I couldn't hold back if I didn't. So I came to it with great anticipation. And so she does a lot of the longer poems. There's no what I would call imagist-centered poems in this book. And as I said, I think she's at her best as an imagist. But in her earlier works, which I have gone back and looked at, but the poetry books are over on those shelves over there, she has become a master of the line. Now, when one writes in free verse is not just open. It's freeing from formal meter. So when you free from formal meter, a good poet will compensate, will have some compensatory measure. Is that a poetry joke? I don't know. It would be a bad one if it was. You have to be really, if you're going to free verse from regular meter, then you have to have another compensatory measure, like strong images or strong metaphors or strong use of lines or some other compensatory thing to hold it together. And in the earlier works where I was most favorably impressed with Alice Walker's work was with the images. But you can't do any one of those, I don't think. Like, you can't just write metered poetry and think it's going to be great poetry. It takes more than just meter to make great poetry. It takes thought. It takes a poetic soul, or it has to come across. Lots of us have poetic souls but are unable to bring that across in our writings. But here in this book, Alice Walker shows her control of the line. It's her great control of the line. And when she's got that combined with images or metaphors or some other poetic technique, she's sparkle. She's at her best. Where it's just about the line, to me, to my ear, it comes a little flat, even when you've got great thoughts behind it, which really kills me to say, because even the poems that to me strike my ear, not generally just my ear, as flat, say such important things, generate such important conversations, that I think they should be read anyway, even though I couldn't say that it was a great poem. I hate myself right now, but I got to say that this book, I recommend it to be read, because there are a number of poems that are really, really, really good. There are some that fall flat, but even they have important thought behind them and will either get you to thinking or get you, more importantly, into a conversation. So let me go to some of the... Well, here's one that whether you want to call it important thought or not, when a poet refers back to their writings, in this one to this is called "Is Celie Actually Ugly?" Celie from the Color Purple. She was described by many other people in the book, at characters in the book describing her, would have described her as ugly. So this is Celie actually ugly? Is Celie actually ugly? Asked the charismatic star playing her on Broadway. How many times over the years I have explained this. Celie and her prettier sister, Nettie, are practically identical. They might be twins, but life has forced on Celie all the hardships Nettie mostly avoids: a hazy anxiety surrounding the lynching of her father when she was very small, repeated rape, a mother's withheld love that morphed into distrust and disdain, her children, for all she knows, murdered by the rapist psychopath who claims to be her father, endless labor that would demean and soon obliterate the observable loveliness of the most queenly slave. I wanted us to think about how superficial is our understanding of beauty, but also how beauty is destroyed, and how, to bear our own disgrace these hundreds of years, we've taught ourselves to laugh at anyone as abused and diminished as we feel. It is Celie's designation as, she uses the N-word, which I won't repeat, of the universe, that by heartless sufferers around her, that makes her ugly to them, they who cannot see until love of herself lights the dreariness in Celie's existence, that the beauty of her resilient spirit has become one with the compassionate loveliness of her face. Now, if you've ever read or seen the movie, at least, The Color Purple, you'll understand where that's coming from. I would also say there's a good, strong use of line in this one. She knows where to make the line breaks and enjambments. So she's in control of that. And I think she makes an important statement in this. So it rises between a statement and the line use. It rises to good poetry. Wherever you are grieving is another good one. This is one of my favorites in the book. It does not matter to me wherever you are grieving, whether Paris, Damascus, Jerusalem, Bamako, Mexico, or Beirut, or New York City. My heart, too, is bruised and dragging. There used to be such a thing as melodrama, when feelings could be made up. But now there is bare pain and sorrow, a sense of endlessly missed opportunities to smile and embrace the other. We mourn the loss of goodness, that was so divinely ordinary, babyhood, youth, the blessing of maturity and of old age, all sacrificed now almost predictably to the same greed our histories, every one of them, could have warned us against if only we knew them. When you end a poem in a line like, if only we knew them, when you speak of your own histories, someone needs to listen. Another one of my favorites is The Mother of Trees, which, as you can probably guess from the beginning, from just the title, it uses a really good use of metaphor. But I can see I'm going along on this thing again. I get involved with Alice Walker and I can't shut up. So I'm trying to keep these things within earshot. The Fullness of My Heart is another one I put out. Let me go to what I would call one that hit my ear is flat. So how it hit your ear, I'll try to do it justice, but it may hit your ear. But to me, it runs out flat. Confident application of joy. How particular it feels to speak about healthcare in America, taking care of people's health while our government bombs the limbs off children in faraway lands and starves and imprisons not a few of them at home. How odd it seems, not obviously known, that true health care must mean, at minimum, deliberate non-harming of anyone. How strange is haggling over how much this or that medical procedure is going to cost, meaning strictly where our bodies, and they are precious, are concerned. While over there, military procedures our country exports may slice a grandfather in half, while his grandchildren, who have crowded around him in confident anticipation of joy, become clots of blood and matted hair on the walls. What's left of the walls? Weird how we talk and haggle as if we are the only people in the universe needing care of our health. Healthcare, care of life itself. What the maimed and slaughtered in many lands have died, hopelessly crying for. That was probably my third reading of that, and it's beginning to grow on me as far as the line breaks and the internal rhythms. Maybe I'll have to change my mind on that poem. But and certainly my first and my second readings of that poem, extremely important thing to say. Discussion point, yes. But now it's starting to grow on my ears now. It's starting to change my mind about this particular poem. But it in the first reading, it just fell flat. It didn't hit me as it was. The internal rhythms didn't come out to me. And straightforward. Alice Walker is a straightforward person. To hear her speak, to hear or to read her writings, you know that she is a very straightforward person. And maybe it just struck me as straightforward and, oh God, don't make me say it, not poetic. Oh man, I hate myself already. But as you can tell, whether you agree with how that struck the ear, that last poem struck the ear or not, the other poems certainly had not just great lines, but an internal rhythm all their own, a poetic sensibility, and important messaging. And if that last poem struck you flat, or some of those other poems struck you flat, then maybe you understand that there's at least good control of lines and important messaging. So it's something I would encourage you to experience for yourself. If for nothing more than the important messaging, if for nothing else, is if you don't know Alice Walker, know Alice Walker. Get to know Alice Walker. She is an extremely important voice of our time. And I would encourage you to pick up this book. I would encourage you to pick up any of Alice Walker's books. Read them, enjoy them, and have a great day. PoetryTube, BookTube.